Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the incredible true story of how a few incredibly bold reformers completely flipped the justice system on its head back in the 1800s. We're looking at the 19th century prison and disability reforms. Seriously, if you've ever wondered how our modern ideas of fairness and mental health care actually got their start, well, it all began right here. But before we get into the history, I want you to ask yourself a pretty heavy question. What actually happens when a justice system completely lacks compassion? Just imagine a really harsh reality for a second. A world where the justice system treats absolutely everyone exactly the same, but with zero fairness, zero context, and zero understanding. Imagine making one really small mistake, or even worse, simply suffering from an illness that you literally cannot control, and being thrown into the exact same terrifying situation as someone who committed a truly violent crime. When a system operates without compassion, it doesn't solve problems, right? It just creates a whole lot more pain. And unfortunately, that was the exact reality for so many people in the 1800s. All right, let's get into Section 1, the 19th century prison crisis. Overcrowded and unfair. To really wrap our heads around this history, we have to look at the dark reality of the time. Prisons back in the 1800s were, well, they were a nightmare. Dark, dirty, and dangerously overcrowded. Instead of actually helping people get back on their feet, the system just lumped everyone together in one awful place. On one side, you had minor offenders, sometimes literally just young kids who made a bad choice, and people struggling with mental illnesses who simply couldn't care for themselves. And then on the exact same side, you had serious, dangerous adult criminals. In the 19th century, young kids and people with mental illnesses were locked in the exact same cells as adults who had committed severe crimes. People with disabilities weren't given doctors or medicine. No, they were just chained up in the dark. It was, honestly, a total failure of justice. Which brings us to a huge turning point. Section 2, a call for compassion, the moral motivation for reform. You see, changing a massive, broken system like that requires a deep moral awakening. Reformers finally realized that treating people this cruelly wasn't just bad law, it was deeply, fundamentally wrong. They knew they had to inject compassion back into the justice system if they ever wanted things to actually improve. And that moral courage, it came directly from Scripture, specifically Psalm 82, verse 3. Defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. For the reformers of the 1800s, this wasn't just a nice-sounding quote. It was a strict command. This biblical call to compassion absolutely drove them. They looked at the prisoners, the young kids, and the mentally ill, and they saw the weak and the oppressed. They realized, someone actually has to step up and defend those who can't fight for themselves. And that leads us straight into Section 3. Dorothea Dix takes action. One woman's fight for the vulnerable. So Dorothea Dix sees this absolute nightmare of a system, and she didn't just feel bad about it and move on. No, she decided it was time to take real, concrete action, especially for the mentally ill. She was just an everyday citizen, but she had an extraordinary sense of moral duty. So how do you even begin to change a whole country's justice system? Well, she took 3 incredibly systematic steps. First, she actually toured the prisons herself. She walked right into those dark, terrible places and meticulously documented the horrific conditions she saw. Second, she didn't just keep a diary. She took those notes directly to the lawmakers. She forced them to look at the undeniable proof of what was happening on their watch. And third, through sheer determination and cold, hard facts, she helped pass entirely new laws. She literally forced the creation of mental hospitals so that people with illnesses could finally get medical care instead of being thrown in a prison cell. Because of her relentless work, we enter an era of massive change. Let's look at Section 4, 3 major justice reforms, changing the system. The lasting impact of Dix's advocacy caused lawmakers to completely rethink the whole concept of justice. They finally realized that punishment alone, without any sort of care or teaching, well, it doesn't really help anyone. They had to redesign the system from the ground up to actually make it humane. And this brings us to one of the absolute most important words to come out of this entire era, rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is focused on preparing prisoners to successfully rejoin society, rather than just punishing them. This was a massive shift in human history. Instead of just locking people up in the dark and forgetting about them, the system started asking, hey, how can we help this person improve? How can we help them grow so that when they finally get out, they can actually be a good contributing citizen? So to boil down these massive historical changes, the system really shifted in 3 major ways. First, they finally separated prisoners by the seriousness of their crime. No more tossing minor offenders in with dangerous adults. Second, they created juvenile facilities. Now, this was a total game changer. It meant young offenders, kids who just made bad mistakes, were protected and kept totally away from adult criminals so they could actually be reformed and get a second chance. And third, the whole system shifted its focus toward that crucial concept of rehabilitation, ensuring proper mental care for those who are sick, largely thanks to those new mental hospitals championed by Dorothea Dix. Now let's fast forward from the 1800s to right now. Section 5, Why Morality Matters Today, the HeroesMart Academy Philosophy. We've talked a lot about the what, the why, and the how of 19th century history. But look, history isn't just about memorizing facts and dates. It's about figuring out how to live today. Those reformers we just learned about were incredibly smart, sure, but more importantly, they were guided by a really strong moral compass. So I want to connect these historical lessons of compassion directly to your own life and your education right now as an 8th grader. I really want to challenge you to think about this. What is the actual point of being smart if you just keep making bad choices that hurt? You're all getting an amazing education. You're learning math, science, history, the whole works. But having a great education just isn't enough if it isn't guided by a strong moral compass. Think about it. If you have all the facts in your head, but you use them to be cruel, or you make choices that hurt yourself and the people around you, what good is being smart? That is exactly why we have to look to a higher truth. Romans chapter 8, verses 6 and 7 actually promises peace of mind to everyone who keeps his or her mind spiritual. Think about those early reformers again. They were staring down a really stressful, painful world, but they kept their minds focused on spiritual morality. When you align your mind with God's principles, with compassion, with defending the weak, with real, true justice, it brings you deep, personal peace. This isn't just some ancient promise. It is something we can experience every single day when we engage with spiritual truths. And honestly, this brings us to the absolute core philosophy of the HeroesMart Academy Godly Learners series. Education without morality will hurt. We intertwine biblical morality with your education for this exact reason. Dorothea Dix didn't just use her brain to write up some reports. No, she used her God-given morality to demand compassion. Without that kind of moral foundation, systems break down, people get hurt, and societies just fail. True education absolutely must be intertwined with biblical morality if it's ever going to heal the world instead of harming it. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. You've just seen exactly what happens when people use their voices and their smarts to bring compassion into a totally broken system. And you are gaining knowledge every single day. So, will you use your education to uphold compassion and defend the weak? Will you be the kind of godly learner who pairs a really sharp mind with a deeply moral, spiritual heart? Really think about how you're going to apply your own smarts and your own morality to make your classroom, your community, and eventually the whole world a much, much better place. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep learning, keep caring, and I'll catch you next time.